It's good to be with you all this, I think, afternoon for you, for many of you on the East Coast, and morning for me here out in California. I'm just going to share my screen and talk a little bit about the program that I ran, the course, and it is still going on at WashU, but I am not there running it. Right now, it's being run by another faculty member, but I'm going to start the program here at Stanford. So I'm just going to walk you through and about teaching my Angelous why I know why the caged bird sings. And our program was called Citizenship from Plato to Maya Angelou. And I'll walk you through, I want to walk you through why I chose the text, and then also a little bit about how we taught it. So first and foremost, there were three reasons why I chose the text, and I'll walk through those. The first was backwards design, the way that I designed the class using backwards design. The second was the idea to expand the canon of classical texts or texts that students were going to read. And the third reason was to make a local connection. So I'll walk through these three really quickly and then talk a little bit about the text, and then we'll have a chance to any questions you may have. So first and foremost, backwards design. Many of you may be familiar with this. It's based on a book by Grant Wiggins and Jay Mattei called Understanding by Design, written in 2005. And they argue that instructors typically approach course design in a forward design manner, meaning they consider learning activities or how to teach the content and assessments around their learning activities, and then attempt to draw connections to the learning goals or objectives of the course. Said in another way, oftentimes I think, especially for newly minted PhDs, oftentimes when we think about teaching a class, the first thing we think about is content. What do I want my students to read? What do I want my students what text should they engage? And I think with the citizenship and freedom, I immediately thought about, okay, like what's the canon? What are the important texts that I want students to read? You know, Hobbes and Plato, Aristotle, etc. But backwards design encouraged me to think first and foremost about what I want my students to learn, what I want them to know, what I want them to be able to do. So what backwards design argues then is that in contrast, the backwards design approach has instructors consider their learning goals of the course first. These learning goals embody the knowledge and skills instructors want their students to have learned when they leave the class. So when I was designing from Plato to Maya Angelou, or that's how it kind of got named that way rather, I thought about what did I want the high school students to know when they leave the class? What do I want them to be able to do when they leave the class? So the major question for the course was, well, let me show this about backwards design first. So here's a little diagram I got from the book. I wanted everyone to see. So the way that you think about planning the class is to identify desired results, the big ideas and skills. Then you determine acceptable evidence, meaning your assessments, what things you want students to do, so you can measure those results. And then third, finally, what are the kind of learning events? What material, what data do the students need to be able to complete the assessments? And so that's how I went about designing this class. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this teaching technique. It's very simple, but I think it's profound in its results to start with the end result first and then work backwards. And I think especially for new teachers, it's important because often, again, as a new teacher, you may be thinking, okay, my students have to read this text because they just have to, right? And starting there sometimes can lead you astray. But I think if starting in the backwards design manner, it can kind of guide you along the way to make sure your students are actually gaining the skills and the big ideas that you want them to have. So for our class, I started with the question of how can authors of the past inform our understanding of liberty and self-governance? That's how I started. That was the big question. How can authors of the past inform our understanding of liberty and self-governance? And what I wanted my students to be able to do was actually be able to, I wanted them to be able to utilize historical writings to analyze and engage contemporary issues of liberty and governance in the St. Louis region. I wanted them to be able to, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, but I wanted them to be able to look at the Ferguson report, right? These are students who grew up and came of age, were probably in junior high or elementary school when Michael Brown was murdered in St. Louis and when the Ferguson uprising occurred in 2014. So these were students who were probably, maybe 8 years old at the time, maybe 10 years old at the time. So I wanted them to be able to read the Ferguson report and be able to see, to talk about maybe how Hobbes can inform them, how they understand what's some of the problems in the Ferguson report or happening in the Ferguson region, or Plato or Aristotle or Frederick Douglass. I wanted them to be able to do that, right? And even do so in conversation with one another. So that was the skill I wanted the students to leave with. Now, in backwards design manner, what I did was, oh, sorry about that. Let's see, there we go. Make sure that my screen will advance. Okay, oh, there we go. So what I wanted my students to be able to do that, I figured out my course assessments needed to be a couple things. So every class session, we students did a quote note question. So that was to make sure that they were reading and make sure they were understanding. So if there were any quotes in the readings that we did, I wanted students to come to class with a quote, a note about it, and then a question. And that was to make sure they were able to, we were grasping the basic concepts of the reading so they could actually do the assessments and be able to leave the course with what I wanted them to leave with. Another task they had to do was write an editorial addressing the most pressing issue in their region. So an editorial for their student newspaper, if they wanted to dream big, it could be the New York Times or Newsweek or CNN. I wanted them to write an editorial, be able to address issues in their region while using some of the writers that we engaged during the semester. And finally, as I mentioned, I wanted them to be able to ultimately be able to engage the Ferguson report. So what the second reason of teaching this text, excuse me, was I wanted them to know the canon of Western political thought, excuse me. Thank you. I wanted them to know the, canon of Western political thought, and then I wanted them to be able to also be able to apply it to the US context. So one way I did that was we also read texts such as Frederick Douglass, we read Ella Baker, we read text also Martin Luther King, we also, and of course we read Maya Angelou. So I wanted them to be able to take some of the ideas from Western political thought, the sort of canon that we know so well, but then see how it's playing out within the US. So students even read the Declaration of Independence and text of that nature so they could see how these ideals shape the American experience and then some of the criticism of the American experience. And then finally, I wanted them to read this text because the way that it talks about race and gender in a way that you don't always get when you're looking at the Western political canon in terms of some of the earlier writings. I wanted them to read this text because they live in a society where race and gender and sexuality are so prominent in our public discussions and our public life. And I wanted them to have tools to be able to analyze that in a more modern US context. So that's another reason why I wanted them to read this text. And so finally, the St. Louis connection, and then that's where I'll get to the text. Marguerite Ann Johnson, or Maya Angelou, was born in St. Louis. She spent a good deal of time in St. Louis. She has a star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame. Yes, St. Louis has a Walk of Fame, for those of you who didn't know. And she's on the St. Louis Walk of Fame, and she spent a good deal of time of her childhood. So that was another reason why this text was perfect for our students. The text was lauded. It was written in 1969. The text was lauded by everyone. The version that we have for the students has a foreword by Oprah Winfrey because the text was so popular. And the other reason I wanted them to read the text is not only is it she spends a good time of St. Louis, this is the first of a 7-part autobiographical series by Maya Angelou. And this text ends when she's 17. So it's perfect, right? So we're dealing with 17-year-olds who are taking our class. Most of them are 17 or 16. So they really can not only see themselves, and when she references streets in St. Louis, some of the students were like, I know where that is, and also though she's writing about a time period all the way up to 17 that many of them are experiencing here. And so what we did throughout the text, how I taught it, was that students were to read the text and come up with questions or places where they see issues of liberty, self-governance, democratic practice, gaps in the social contract, the role of the state. And that's how we had students read this as the last text. So just imagine they've had a whole entire seminar where they've read Hobbes, they've read Plato, they've read Aristotle, they've read Thomas Jefferson, they've read Frederick Douglass, they've read Lincoln, they've read Martin King, Ella Baker, so forth and so on. And so now that they're armed with these tools, now they're reading this autobiography, and looking for places where they can integrate Hobbes and Plato and Aristotle into her experience, right? And to help them analyze this text. And it was just a flat out wonderful and fun experience. For those of you who haven't read the text, there's a great deal of conversation about the role that race, for example, played in her life, about the fact that those who raised her didn't always have access to the same amount of wages or salary as white Americans did at the time when she was growing up, about Jim Crow and about racism. And so it allows them to, and I found this with even my college students, it's easier at times for students to follow along with a particular character or a particular person than just ideas. But if you can ground them in a person's life or experience and then allow them to analyze the ideas that way, they're really able to hold on to it and grasp it and do it in it to a level that, to be honest with you, really impressed me and surprised me. I was so impressed with the way that the students were analyzing the text, the way they analyzed everything from her childhood, the way they related to her childhood, the way that they saw the way that the social contract failed her in so many different ways. And then they were able to also bring in analysis about gender, and able to bring in analysis about, again, about race and things in this nature. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, it was the first time we taught it. I was a little concerned, but the students impressed me. They just blew me away. And frankly, it's from the reviews that we got, and I won't share any of the comments students got. I'll just give you a broad idea about how our students felt about it. But it blew me away, and I'm very, very thankful for it. So students, as I said earlier, they love the local connection. It really made the ideas come home to them, right? So while in the St. Louis region, is democratic governance failing? Where is it thriving? How is it shaped? And this book helped them to do that. Another thing that they were inspired, that here was someone, and this was a byproduct. This is not something I was aiming to do, But they thought here was someone who is from St. Louis, born in St. Louis, and became this world-renowned writer. And, many of them I had to show because I realized that, she passed away and many of them wouldn't know who she was. I had to show them brief clips before they read the text about Maya Angelou and performing the 1993, performing at the 1993 presidential inauguration for Bill Clinton. And she was the second poet to ever do that, I think, after Robert Frost performed at, I believe, JFK's inauguration. So they saw that, and wow, this person is from St. Louis, and look at all the amazing things that she accomplished. So that had an effect that I didn't even anticipate, and inspiring the students about to think big and to think about their own lives. And to see someone from St. Louis, especially a person of color, who was famous, not just for, I'll be very frank, not just for sports or music, right? That there's someone who is famous and is well known and has had an impact in her community and everywhere she's gone simply by using her words. And that was an impact upon students that I think I did not anticipate using this text, but it turned out really well. And most of us know that when these moments happen in class, you're like, you wish you could say, yeah, I planned for that, right? But this is not one of those things that I planned for, but it did happen that way. And finally, they really enjoyed the opportunity to utilize the historic writings and resources that we had to analyze the text grounded in St. Louis. And that what it did then was propel them, right? So this was an assignment. This was the final reading. So now what it did was that it showed them how to do what I was asking them to do and the skill set that I wanted them to have in order to then complete the final assignment, which was to look at the Ferguson report and to ask questions about what's happening around liberty and self-governance in the St. Louis region. Where are the holes? Where are the gaps? So that way they can engage democratic citizens, right? Small d, engaged and be informed by history, this long history of Western political thought, and some of the failures, some of the contestations. And so now they were prepared for their final assignment. And then also, once they did the final assignment, we had a year-long project where we had students engage people and have speakers and shareholders who were listed in the Ferguson report, whether it's school officials, local elected officials. So now we have students who are able to engage these sorts of individuals who are shareholders in the St. Louis region. They can engage them and ask these really informed questions, right? About what is the purpose of education, or why are we falling short on schooling or inequality in schools? And so this text in many ways provided the perfect opportunity for an exercise in what I hope the students will be doing, both not just in the class, but hopefully for the rest of their lives. And so this text really provided a wonderful opportunity to do that.